مَا يَفْعَلُ اللَّهُ بِعَذَابِكُمْ إِن شَكَرْتُمْ. If you believe in Allah and are thankful to Allah, what will Allah gain by the pain and suffering that you have? Which means, brothers and sisters, one of the main purposes of pain is for a higher cause. And the higher cause is for us to recognize Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and to turn to Allah and to worship Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. In other words, one of the greatest wisdoms of anxiety, of mental grief, of physical pain, is so that we rediscover the importance of Allah and of prayer to Allah and of dua to Allah and of calling out to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. If you think about it, subhanAllah, when is your dua the most powerful and strong? When do you raise your hands with the utmost khushu' and humility? It is when you are in grief, when you're in tragedy, when you're in pain, when your loved one is sick, when some grief and calamity happens. That's when your hand raises up to Allah, and from the depths of your soul you make dua to Him. Guess what? That is the purpose of the pain and suffering. That's the purpose of the grief. Because sometimes living the life, our bodies become so luxurious, we forget the needs of the soul. Living the good life, we forget the higher calling. Living the good life, we don't think of death. But what happens when a pain afflicts us? When a loved one is sick, all of a sudden we start thinking of the akhirah, of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and therefore our ruh, our soul reaches out to Allah. As the Quran says, when a calamity touches mankind, وَإِذَا مَسَّ الْإِنسَانَ الضُّرُّ, He starts praying to us, standing, sitting and lying down. He makes dua to us. As the Quran says, when they're about to drown in the ocean, they remember us and they make dua sincerely. As the Quran says, when any type of grief hits mankind, He remembers us. When the grief goes away, He turns away and forgets about us. Over a dozen verses in the Quran, over a dozen verses that when you are in calamity and tragedy, you turn to Allah. Now I want to be very clear here, listen to this carefully. Allah never criticizes turning to Him at times of tragedy. Allah criticizes neglecting Him after the tragedy is over. Allah never criticizes making dua at times of tragedy. That's not a criticism, that's not a problem. So if one of you rediscovers Allah when you're sick, when your child is sick, when you're going through a financial crisis and emotional loss, and you're making extra dua to Allah, don't feel guilty. That is the reason why you're in pain and suffering. Allah Azza wa Jal, just like the doctor's giving you the shot for a greater goal, there's a greater purpose. There is pain, but the pain will protect you from a bigger pain. So the purpose of that smaller pain is so that you rediscover the pleasure of worshipping Allah.